Lots. I completely agree. Like here in Vegas, the two major casino hacks last year have, of course, we're all over the news. You had Caesars and MGM, and now anytime someone comes to town and there's a little bit of a delay with registration because the registration system goes down or something, they immediately assume that there's been a hack.
Unfortunately, they hit at a point, a nexus, an inflection point in an organization's planning that has for many years probably been one of the softer underbellies of business continuity and disaster recovery preparation, right? And because many organizations really don't have a grasp, a very good understanding of how to approach and how to address taking on the complexities of business continuity. Hey, how do we keep the lights on in the face of adversity and disaster recovery? What do we do when the lights are no longer there because the ceiling as well as the building is gone? Where do we go? How do we respond? How do we restart?
From major casino hacks to the rise of ransomware, the threat landscape is more daunting than ever before. Learn how to fortify your defenses with expert advice from cybersecurity guru Adam Gordon. Going to want to listen to this entire episode.
Hey, Mike, thank you for having me. Hello, everybody.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here. I understand that you're a cybersecurity expert. So I wanted to ask you that with your role in educational initiatives at New Horizons, how do you see the intersection of continuous learning and cybersecurity as essential for modern enterprises to thrive today in the threat landscape?
Sure. It's an interesting time in our ecosystem. When you look out at where most businesses, most organizations or enterprises find themselves today, they sit really at the kind of intersection of three major, I think, trends, right? Or issues and concerns and those workflows that surround them. They're having to deal with legacy debt, technological debt in organizations is a huge burden, a huge liability. They've inherited either through their own acquisition and building of new technology platforms over time and how we normally do that. A lot of legacy tech that they're probably not dealing with very efficiently from a GRC, a governance, risk management, and compliance perspective. There may be merger and acquisition activities that are taking place in and among members of their vertical in their sector. So you're inheriting when you merge and acquire a company, the technical debt that company has, and you're buying that along with everything else as part of the asset package. So there's a lot of those kind of issues. You've got concerns around emerging and new technologies that can open up an organization to tremendous growth and productivity opportunities, but at the same time, tremendous risk. Artificial intelligence, machine learning is a good example, right, in these areas of things that would fall into that category. And there are many others. And then one that I think has been around for a long time, but we don't often think about it perhaps as much. And I think certainly in the proper ways that we should as leaders or even just practitioners is risk. And risk is a very broad, right? Very large landscape, although it's only a four-letter word. It's a very large landscape that we paint when we use that word. And what I think and what I try to talk to with my customers and people that I spend time with, my consulting practice and things of that nature, is not just risk, but let's be specific. Let's talk about not just third party risk, which is a very big buzzword, right? You hear a lot about, or buzz phrase, you hear a lot about today. But what you don't hear people talking about, what I think is the missing piece, is fourth party risk. It's the third party risk that we have in an organization, but once removed. So when I talk about third party risk, or you and I think about it, we think about essentially a traditional outsource model. Oh, my vendor that I'm paying to provide a service is my third party in that equation. What about the vendors that vendor relies on in their supply chain that are invisible to me, or perhaps semi visible at best, but I'm not auditing. I'm probably not going to have awareness of in a meaningful way. I'm probably not monitoring, and I'm not engaging in a meaningful way from a GRC, a governance, risk management, compliance perspective. There's minimal, if any, due diligence and due care, right, in that extended relationship. And as a result, that fourth party risk and even fifth party risk, because we can go down that supply chain several levels, right, these days, becomes a very huge but unfortunately ill-defined liability for organizations. When you ask about what are some of those things, right, that I see or we see we should be thinking about, we should talk about, where is that awareness? Where should we be heading? Those are very broad brushstrokes, but I think there's a lot of opportunity inside of those key areas to discuss any number of areas of concern, but also of potential, I think, profitability, improvement, sustainability, and overall growth for organizations if they're willing to step up and really discuss some things that are sometimes a little hard, a little difficult to perhaps get their head around, but also to face some really, ugly truths, right? We have technical debt, we have liability, we have policies and technology that we're probably not managing efficiently, and we need to do a better job as an organization overall.
Well, I completely agree. Like here in Vegas, the two major casino hacks last year have, of course, were all over the news. You had Caesars and MGM, and now anytime someone comes to town and there's a little bit of a delay with registration because the registration system goes down or something, they immediately assume that there's been a hack. It makes me wonder, like, how has the landscape of threats, cybersecurity threats, evolved in recent years?
It's taken some interesting twists and turns, right? We could go back however far back along that timeline you want to go back to. You chose to go back about roughly now about 12 to 18 months, right? In terms of those casino or gaming industry issues that came up over the last 18 months. But we could look back several years and really see probably two or three major trends that have emerged. The most important one, I think, to this day, still, even as we're talking now and past where we're talking when this episode will actually air eventually, even though we're shooting it live, it's not going to go out right away. We can think about the role of the nation state, right? And the emergence, and really, I think, not just emergence, but the aggressiveness that nation states, certain nation states, have taken with regards to their posture in cyberspace and their activities. And let's be clear, we're talking about a subset of nation states that are in many respects on multiple lists for multiple activities that are embargoed or perhaps, for some reason seen as being problematic in many areas of the world, without naming names, without pointing a finger at any one or perhaps a group of nation state actors. But we probably all can get a sense of who those nation states may be, right? When we think about the ones that are at the top of any of those lists of bad actors. And they, for a long time, had worked in the shadows, had done these kind of things. It's not as if all of a sudden those leaders woke up one day 5, 10 years ago and said, you know what, excuse me, we're going to decide to start really acting this way. They've been doing and executing these kinds of operations for some time, but they were very quiet and for the most part, really not well publicized. But I think a key turning point was or has been not just the fact that those nation states are active in cyberspace. Traditionally, they've been active in looking at cyber espionage, industrial espionage, looking for economic and or political, perhaps economic or military advantage. But when they really chose to move into areas where they decided to confront not just other nation states, but really merge their activities into the private sector realm and go after individual corporations and highly corporations, as well as government connected entities that, for one reason or another, would not just perhaps be disruptive from an economic standpoint, but potentially could be disruptive because they were perhaps executing on or preparing the ground to execute on more invasive cyber operations that could be much more disruptive in the public safety and the public sector spheres, right? Quality of life, economic indicators could be affected. You could take out a key representative business in a very high profile industry, and all of a sudden you could disrupt, right, a global economic flow. But really, the nature of that activity has changed in the last several years. And as a result, it's become a lot more problematic. Although I think the average person and perhaps even the average business leader still doesn't really understand the impact of those things, right? They really probably don't wake up every day thinking, oh, this country may attack my business because they see an advantage. They read about it in the headlines, but they don't really necessarily put those pieces together. But when you read that a water treatment plant in your area, perhaps depending on where you live in the country, or this particular business or that particular transportation network was targeted, perhaps unsuccessfully, but was targeted, the average person tends to really become very nervous and I think start to pay hyper attention, right? They become super focused on those activities. And either of those states I think are very problematic because the average individual honestly has next to nothing to really fear from the majority of these activities. They're not directed at them in any meaningful way.
Right.
They may be in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? Accidentally at any given moment in time. But nation state X is not looking to attack you, average citizen, right? Just because you are who you are. They're looking to disrupt, right? And you may or just may not be in the blast radius. So you have to pay attention to that, of course. But today, for instance, and I hate to say this just because of what's happened with headlines, but I would be much more concerned about stepping onto a commercial airliner today, regardless of who is piloting and what airline is driving those aircraft. And given the rash of safety concerns that we have seen in recent months around just the what has been up until now, honestly, for close to 100 years, historically one of the safest transportation
Right.
solutions globally, right, that we have as humans have ever produced, much safer until very recently, and even still today, with all the disruption going on, still safer than doing what we do every day, getting in a car and driving yourself somewhere. Air travel historically has been much safer than taking a train or riding on a boat. I would be a little more hesitant today to step onto an airline and take a flight than I would be worried about some sort of cyber attack coming from a third party nation state affecting me directly. But because they are so dramatic when they happen and they make such splashy headlines today, because let's be honest, they're exciting, they're cool, they're sexy to talk about, right? They make good news. People hear about them and they get blown out of proportion. But I do think that those kinds of activities have radically changed in the last 5 or 10 years in their scope and their focus. I think also in general, as a subset of that, because I think that encompasses a very broad set of activities, but one that I think is much closer to the average individual that we probably connect with on a more regular basis and is probably more meaningful for the average person or business that is attacked successfully is the advent of ransomware and more importantly the rise
Hmm.
of ransomware based attacks because ransomware itself again has been around for a long time but it was really lurking in the shadows until maybe the last 3 or 4, maybe 5 years. Again, we see these things tie together in lockstep. The rise of nation state activity is really side by side in parallel, can be tracked with the rise of ransomware attacks against public infrastructure, hospitals, right, and organizations that are in those spaces, educational institutions, healthcare providers, things like that have been the targets in the last several years. In particular, the Kaisera attack, for instance, and other attacks speak to this kind of thing. SolarWinds, right? These are large-scale attacks, government-sponsored or nation-state sponsored against other nation-state and critical infrastructure industries. And ransomware attacks fall into that category. There are, again, several nation-state actors that are well known to be providing support and harboring these groups that are engaging in these activities, depending on where we're talking about in the world. And they are very impactful. Unfortunately, they hit at a point, a nexus, an inflection point in an organization's planning that has for many years probably been one of the softer underbellies of business continuity and disaster recovery preparation in an organization. And because many organizations really don't have a grasp, a very good understanding of how to approach and how to address taking on the complexities of business continuity. Hey, how do we keep the lights on in the face of adversity and disaster recovery? What do we do when the lights are no longer there because the ceiling as well as the building is gone? Where do we go? How do we respond? How do we restart? How do we pick back up and live to fight another day? Because they don't understand those things and they don't have policy, procedure, process, and personnel, the four magical P's, right, that we need in that space to be able to attack this problem from a strategic, tactical, and operational level and to understand how to address it. They hopefully don't have an issue, but they are hoping for the best and they're not really planning for the worst. And because they don't have a good solution, they don't have backups of their systems. They don't have the modern technologies deployed that would allow them to essentially recover from a ransomware attack and politely tell the ransomware attacker, thank you, but no thank you. We're not going to pay. We'll take the 1 or 2 days or 1 or 2 weeks of disruption, but we're going to work through this and we're going to get back online and we're going to, show our customers that we know how to do the things we need to do. I work with a lot of companies and a lot of businesses all over the world in government, military, public, private sector, and I have for decades as a consultant. And reality is, when I have most of the conversations that you have about these things in most of the entities that I do business with, they're aware. It's not as if there's no awareness of the issue, right? Senior business leaders, whatever their title may be, whether they're a president, a VP, a C-level executive, whatever they call themselves in that organization, they're aware of these issues at a certain level. But the lack, I think, of the disconnect of operationalizing that awareness is they don't have those middle level people in the organization that can take that strategic imperative and translate it into a tactical execution that is going to lead them to be more prepared. And when you're missing that connection, you can talk about this all day in the boardroom and in the C-level executive meetings and whatever. It's never going to translate down is the problem. And it often does not. There's a disconnect. So things like ransomware, I think, really sit at the top of that list. But I think there's also been another huge trend, which is the rise of risky user behavior or just risky behavior in general, right? But we refer to it often as risky user behavior these days as we monitor it. And I think it takes on a lot of guises, right? It could be something as simple as a user meaningful in doing good and purposely trying to do the right thing, but acting in a way because they haven't been given the proper guidance and tools that exposes them, and by extension, the organization, to risk. They log onto a public Wi-Fi hotspot
Mm-hmm.
somewhere, check their email or perhaps do something, whatever they may need to do. They don't think about it. We've all been in Starbucks or McDonald's or who knows where, not naming those companies because they're good or bad in any way. Just, they provide public Wi-Fi, as many do to their customers. And you've been in an airport or a hotel, right? It doesn't have to be in an establishment that has food, even on a plane today. And I'm amazed constantly. I travel a great deal for what I do, and prior to COVID, I might have been on a good year on the road over 200 days a year, right? On
Wow.
a bad year, it might have been closer to 300. And so I spend the bulk of my time traveling. I spend a lot of time in hotels, a lot of time in airports and on airplanes. And I'm amazed as a security practitioner and a professional who manages risk for a living. I'm just amazed at the number of conversations that I am privy to accidentally just by sitting somewhere and hearing people going through their day, not thinking about what or who is around them. That if I was a bad person looking to do bad things that I could use to my advantage, I would be retired right now on my own private island somewhere, right? And I wouldn't have to worry about doing the things that I, although love to do, that I have to do in order to make a living, because I would have traded on that information and I would have been incredibly wealthy as a result. Whether it's somebody yelling into a phone at a colleague because they're frustrated with how their day is going and releasing confidential information, whether it's someone getting up from their laptop and walking away, leaving it unlocked without a screen protector or a glare protector to obfuscate the screen, on a plane, being handed someone's laptop because they have to get up and go to the bathroom and they ask you to hold it and they don't think about the fact that it's unlocked and they're going to be gone for 3 or 4 minutes. Now, granted, I'm on a plane. I'm not going to steal your laptop. I'm not going to run away with it. I can't get very far if I do. But could I put malware on that laptop? Could I go through your files? Yeah, I could. Am I one of the people that if you give a laptop to could get into it and would be able to take advantage of that information? Yeah, that's what I do for a living. I show people how to do that stuff ethically to make sure that they can defend against those activities. And you don't ever know who's around you and you don't know who you're dealing with. And my mother, and I'm sure all of our parents at some point in our lives early on, probably instilled the idea of stranger danger in you when you were a child, right? And it's a mantra that makes sense today. You have to be aware and wary of your environment. And I think risky user behavior is one of the things that keeps me and probably a lot of your listeners as senior level executives in organizations fraught with concern about risk and where it's going to enter the organization, keeps them up at night. I have a lot of conversations with C-level executives about how to deal not with the bad actor who's going to ransom my network, but the meaningful good user who's going to wind up doing something problematic because of a phishing attack or a business email compromise, and is going to inadvertently rack up a HIPAA violation because they expose PHI, or is going to have some sort of impact, right, on some sort of privacy related concern, whether it's HIPAA, high tech, whether it's high trust, whether it's PCI DSS, name your framework, and your framework fine as associated, right, with that framework. And we have issues, right, everywhere. So these are all big areas of concern. But I think risky user behavior is one that realistically, unlike ransomware, unlike some of these other things where we don't really have a lot of control to what shows up in our system, right? Either we're successful at preventing it from compromising us, thankful if we are, probably unaware a lot of the times if we are, because we have automated systems that just block a lot of this. If we're not, we know about it, right? And then that's really when the fire drill starts. But the problem with risky user behavior, it's a slow burn and it's there every day and it just eats away at the underlying architecture and framework of the organization little by little. It's that death by a thousand cuts that we often think about. And it can weaken the organization so dramatically, but so slowly that you don't really see the decay until it's too late a lot of the times. It's that built up inertia, right? That when we get past a certain point, that momentum kicks in and that user behavior all of a sudden snowballs. And now we have a really big issue. The most effective thing you can do from a mitigation perspective as a senior leader is to get into a mindset that challenges your organization about preparedness. How are you addressing security awareness across an organization is what I often ask senior leaders when I speak with them. And I hear a variety of really great ideas and really great answers, but what I don't often hear is that we do it through a consistent, organized, and reproducible set of events that are mandatory and are all inclusive. Oh, it's a sometime activity. We all have those quarterly or semi-annual or annual security awareness training solutions we go through, the checkbox activities, as we often refer to them as. But what I don't often see or hear is a monthly campaign, is a newsletter, is a weekly email that goes out and updates people on suspicious activity, a see something, say something campaign that's being championed by business leaders. It is an old adage, but I think it's very apropos, and I think it's absolutely correct in this situation. The idea of the fact that change starts at the top, and it's a question of having that senior leadership impetus to really live those exact things that you want your culture and your people, your organization, to do. And when you see senior leaders asking for bypasses to policies and not implementing and not paying attention to and taking seriously the same policies that you're asking your coworkers, your colleagues, people that are around you, you work with and work for, to adhere to, it becomes an exercise in really just paper pushing, right? I do a lot of audit work and we do a lot of compliance checking as a result of audit. It's what we do. And we find the things that you do well, but we also find the things that you're not doing well. That's the nature of an audit. And if you have an audit mindset when it comes to security awareness as a senior leader, meaning, hey, I know people are going to be looking at this and I have to make sure that we're doing it the right way. Everybody has to be compliant. That's what I would refer to as an audit mindset. If you have an audit mindset as a senior leader and you go into security awareness with an audit mindset, you're going to come out of that with a much stronger organizational culture because everybody in the organization is going to have to get in line and essentially comply. If you go into it with a traditional mindset of, okay, it's that time of the year, everybody check off the box, we need 95% compliance because the auditors are coming in 2 weeks, it's almost the end of the year. What you get is a bunch of people that don't watch videos and simply check off boxes and they don't learn anything. And that's when risk enters the organization. Risk, and I tell this to my users and my customers all the time, risk is a never sleeping, never tiring monster, right? It lives out there in the world, constantly on watch, waiting for the opportunity to strike. I don't know if you, and by extension, your listeners, are sci-fi movie buffs, but if they are and they've watched the Terminator series, the Terminator movies, one of the more famous scenes among the many across the Terminators that were created. But one of them is when Arnold Schwarzenegger comes back as the good Terminator right after the first movie to protect as opposed to destroy. And you hear this monologue that is going on around the thought process of having him protect, right, the most important person in the world, that the seed that will repopulate the world and change the course of history. And the idea is that he's never going to tire. He's never going to sleep. He never needs to rest. He's never going to stop. And he only has one mission, right? He's going to do what he has to do to protect that life. Risk is the same way, except it's acting in contradiction to that. It's waiting for an opportunity to do harm. And we, as defenders standing on that wall, right, we have to be vigilant all the time, 24/7, 365, to minimize, mitigate risk. We can never zero it out, right? This myth of, well, we'll get rid of all the risk if we just do this is a fallacy. We don't live in a zero risk world. There's no such thing. But we can mitigate it to an acceptable level. And this is where, again, organizations often make a mistake. They think I can get rid of all that risk if I just spend enough money, right? Throw enough money at the problem, I'll get rid of that risk. No, you're going to spend a lot more money than you need to cover that risk over, but you're not going to get rid of it. You're just going to transfer it somewhere else in the organization. Put pressure here, and it'll bubble up right over here somewhere else where there's not as much of a bulwark, not as much of a set of safeguards or an investment. So you're transferring risk. You're not really mitigating it. It's a difference and a different approach. We need to be vigilant all the time. The bad actors and the risk purveyors need to just get lucky one time when we take our eye off that proverbial ball, and they can come in. It's not about preventing risk. And this is sometimes heretical talk, right? You hear people say this, or you hear someone like myself say this, and risk practitioners and GRC practitioners say, oh, hold on, wait a second. It's absolutely about preventing risk. No, not exclusively. It's about mitigating risk, but it's also about being aware of the fact that you're never, ever going to stop every risk. And instead of trying to do so, you should be focusing on what's going to happen when that risk does become realized. How prepared are you? Because it's not a question of if I will get hacked, if I will be breached, if I will be attacked with ransomware, but it's a matter of when one or more of those things will happen to an organization at some point. Hopefully, not all of them, and hopefully not badly in terms of them being combined. The reality is, those things are likely to happen if you're in an organization long enough. You have a public presence, you're connected to the outside world. People are going to want to find out what you're doing and try to take those things that they feel are important away from you because they give them advantage. So you may be able to stop them, but what if you can't? And if you can't, what are you going to do to then take back what is yours? And if you can't answer that question meaningfully with a plan that can be executed by your teams because they understand it, they've been trained on it, and they can go into autopilot to do it when you hit the go button, you're not prepared. And you're not going to be at the time it happens, because at that time, it's unfortunately too late. You can't figure out the plan after the ransomware is already in the system. The plan at that
Right.
point is you better get out your checkbook and hope you have enough money to pay, because there is no other plan at that point. Nothing else you're going to do is going to work. It's just unfortunately too late. So I know it's been a very long kind of expose that I've laid out, right, for your listeners about these areas you asked about and some of the things that I think about them. But yeah, I think these are the really big ticket items, the big things that we think about and should be focusing on.
Yeah, the risky behavior is a big one. I think that's exactly how the MGM hack happened, was they didn't follow their normal processes. The person called in and said, "Oh, and I can't remember my password. Can you reset it for me so I can get in?" And instead of following their standard procedures, person was like, "Oh, sure, no problem." And they validated was like their phone number, which happened to be on the person's LinkedIn. And that's when you're talking about risky behavior, and you brought up like someone sitting next to you on the plane and saying, "Oh, hold on to my laptop, I have to go to the restroom." It's the same kind of thing. Like, if you are an executive at a company and you're putting information out on the public that's going to help people. I've had people use what's your password reset question, and they'll say, it's the mascot of my high school that I graduated from. If you put your high school up there, it's going to take me less than 5 minutes to find out what that answer is. And now I have access to your account. And that's exactly what happened there. But if they would have followed the procedure and called the person, they likely would have found out that, hey, I'm not asking for a password reset. What the heck are you doing? Then some companies make it impossible. I'm just going to give you a personal experience I had about a week ago. I don't really use Facebook anymore. I haven't for 5 or 6 years. And occasionally, the only reason I keep the account open is because occasionally you get you're doing a training with somebody and they're like, here's my group over here on Facebook. We're going to answer questions over there. So I keep it. And so one day I'm in my Gmail, which I only use I've had Gmail since day one, and at this point, I only use it for like when I think someone's going to spam me with emails. I use that. Otherwise, I keep my business account. And I'm noticing, why are there Facebook password reset codes in my email? And they make it so difficult for you to figure out, like, how can I get rid of this email address so that because obviously the person has my email address. How can I get rid of the email address so that it's not in here anymore? They make it so difficult to figure out that people just give up. I'm not that way. Of course, I was tenacious and figured out where it was, but people just give up. I can tell you a story. When I worked as a CTO for a restaurant delivery service, one weekend, CEO never called me on the weekend. One weekend he calls me and he says, I was just meeting with the sales director and she's really concerned because she thinks that these people they can export the customer data and then email it to themselves. So when they quit, they can steal our customers. And she said she wants you to create a template for all of our emails so that it blocks sending attachments. I said, that'd be a complete waste of our time. And he's, why? I said, when I come in on Monday, I'll show you why. And so on Monday, I walk in his office and I said, here, open any spreadsheet. Just open it. Now hit Control A. Now hit Control C. Now open an email and hit Control V. You just
Data and
sent the
put it in.
same data and it's not an attachment. So let's not focus on the stupid ways of fixing the problem. Let's actually try to figure out, and I mean, I proposed things like, there's no reason they should even have access to exporting the customers. They don't need it. That feature was built into the software for the accounting department. So why is the sales department using it, et cetera? Just little things like that. But the risky behavior from users has always been, because humans are the weakest link, it's always been the problem. I see people, you talked about Starbucks. I see people when I go into Starbucks, they're sitting at the table and they're working on their laptop. And the next thing you look over and it's just the laptop and it's wide open and it's not locked. And they're like, hey, I could probably type your bank in here and get right in because you probably also said save my password. And I know these days banks force log you out after you leave, but back then, maybe 5, 10 years ago, they didn't. And it's just taking the time, like you said, taking the time to stop and think about, am I doing something stupid here? What's going to happen? I was surprised you didn't mention some of the scams that go on, but I guess in a sense, that's not really cybersecurity. I tell people all the time, like when they're on social media, I'll say, so like I got one recently. Dave Ramsey sent me a DM on TikTok, and I showed my wife and I go, look, Dave Ramsey is trying to reach me. But some people believe it. And then come on, take a moment
I
and
don't
actually look into it.
I don't spend a lot of time, depending on the format of the conversation I'm having. What I mean specifically is more the audience that I'm speaking with
Right.
when I say the format. But depending on the audience I'm speaking with, you're absolutely right to point it out, Mike. And I think it is a great opportunity to help educate the people that we serve and we spend time with in terms of trying to spread right those good behaviors and try to mitigate or minimize the ones that can get us into trouble. I don't spend a lot of time talking about it in most of the formats and most of the conversations I have, just because, and I think you hit on it earlier. You're not on Facebook, you said, for the last few years. I haven't been on it for, I think I was on it for a couple of years because of some of the reasons you mentioned with keeping track of former trainers and colleagues from New Horizons, et cetera. I haven't been on it for probably better part of 15 years at this point at all. I actually
Good for you.
deleted my account. I'm not even there anymore. But it's if you want to find me professionally, you find me on LinkedIn. That's where I have been for since the beginning of that particular platform. And I happen to be on Twitter now, whatever Elon has decided to call it this week for the last few years. But I really am there and I had a presence there because of the work I was doing with IT Pro TV when I was with them and the education we were providing and the way we'd reach our customers. And Twitter was a social media platform at the time that was very relevant to them. Just like Discord, for instance, and the Discord service that I'm involved with for the mentoring, the tutoring, things like that I do are. But I don't spend as a business professional, especially in the cybersecurity space, I don't really spend a lot of time, as you suggested, you don't, on social media. Now, I think you're also absolutely correct to point out that we, by nature of what we do, are more likely to be educated about those concerns,
Right.
those scams, those right activities, and we're less likely to pay attention to them, and as a result, probably less likely to perhaps have as many issues with them. Although certainly seen colleagues and friends fall prey to them because they, for a variety of reasons, just are not at the top of their game that day. But the reality is, that from my perspective, and I think this is a perspective issue, and I'm glad you brought it up. I think from my perspective, what I do spend time talking about, which does directly tie into this, is something I mentioned earlier. We are talking about some of the things that I think are on the horizon or areas that I tend to focus on. I think it goes back to risky user behavior, but I think it also goes back to things like business email compromise and phishing. Broadly, we refer to them as social engineering, right?
Sure.
Vectors. And I think it is all about social engineering. And that is something that I actually do believe is very important to educate organizations and culturally the people in them around. Because to your point, you don't know where that next unlikely message or too good to be believed offer, right, is going to show up from that might trick someone, maybe not the IT people, maybe not the senior leaders in the organization. But as I often tell my ethical hackers when I'm doing or teaching ethical hacking classes, or when I'm just working either as a member of a purple team, a blue team, or a red team, and we're doing tabletops or whatever the case may be, when I talk to customers and students about this stuff, it's easy if you get the most senior person in the organization, you attack them, you get their credential, game over, flag planted, we're done, right? We get to go home. But they're usually heavily guarded and they're heavily monitored. And it's going to be pretty obvious when you get them, and you're not going to have a lot of time with that credential before you are found out. I want the most senior leader in the organization's credential. I want the lowliest persons in that organization's credential, the one you're probably not paying much attention to,
Right.
the one who probably doesn't know much about policy or process or procedure, has a very limited scope of work and focus in terms of their daily existence, and is really just trying to get by, right? Do what they got to do, shows up to work every day, really good person, is not in any way a high profile target. They're a lot more likely to fall prey to those attacks. And by the way, we're a lot less likely to find out they fell prey to those attacks. The average dwell time is months in an organization for a well-planned attacker. They can live off the land and they can slowly, methodically, laterally move and escalate incrementally, quietly, right, under the radar, because our continuous monitoring and our lines of defense are not tuned to the lower ends of our user spectrum. They're tuned to the upper levels more often than not of our user spectrum, because we feel that's where the likelihood of a breach is highest, because the level of access is highest. I can build access over time by gathering credentials and moving laterally as well as escalating within an organization. Just may take me longer, but I'm going to do much more damage over those 3, 4, 5 months that I'm there than I will if I spend an hour with the most senior leaders in the organization's credentials at my disposal, because the alarm bells are going off and you're racing to find me and I'm racing to get out the door. I can't be effective or methodical. I'm going to grab what I can off the shelf and create a mess along the way, so you probably can't track me very effectively. So it's a very different approach. And the damage and the attacks that have caused tremendous damage over time are the ones that do come in from the bottom and work their way up, as opposed to starting at the top more often than not. So I think it's a really great point you're bringing up. I think it's a really astute observation about where we need to focus. I would just offer that I think we lump those things together traditionally under social engineering. And I think we need to be focused as organizations at the kind of activities that are broad spectrum. We can't just target the upper third or so of our user base in terms of their access and therefore scrutiny. Conditional access policies, forcing multi-factor authentication, password vaulting, credentialing that is just in time and provisioned for immediate use. All of that should be done, but it should be done broadly across the entire organization for everybody, not just the upper levels
Yes.
of the organization. And I see, unfortunately, very often that it's not a complete coverage scenario. It's an intermittent coverage scenario. It's hit and miss. And those cracks in the facade, right, in the outward facing armor of the organization, don't have to be big and gaping to allow an attack in. Because again, probing is happening nonstop, right, all the time. Even if you're not aware of it in your organization, if you actually go and look at the inbound web traffic, if you do monitor these things, and many organizations do today, you're going to see hundreds of thousands on a daily basis of inbound requests for information that are coming from unknown and illicit avenues, right, that you have no knowledge of. Looking relatively benign, But if you start to dig into the headers, start to look at the IPs, see whether or not they're malicious, if they do have known issues associated with them, if you're using software to monitor these things, whatever it may be, you're going to find that you're under constant barrage and constant attack. It's just that most organizations really don't stop to think about it today, right? Because it is so prevalent. But some studies show that as much as 80, perhaps even more, 90% of email that is sent globally on a daily basis is actually fraudulent email, right? Is
Yeah.
spam, business compromise, whatever the case may be. I mean, you think about the staggering numbers of messages that are sent. And you think about the fact that upwards of 80+% of it is essentially just garbage mail. I mean, it's ridiculous when you think about the impact that can have on an organization. Same thing with malware and just bot traffic. Over 50% of internet traffic today is bot traffic, meaning half of all traffic on global networks at any given moment in time, anywhere in the world, is malicious traffic looking for a place to land and do harm. You just ponder that for a minute as a senior leader in an organization. How well defended are you if one out of every two messages that cross your gateways are fraudulent and looking to do you harm? How prepared are you? That's really the question you should be asking.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And so you mentioned the password protection. And I know years back when I was working with the restaurant delivery service, my network engineer wanted to change the password reset rules, but only for the executives. And I told him, why? What's the reason? Like, why do you want to, first of all, why do you want to change the rules? Because they need to change their password more often so that they're not sitting on these silly passwords. And back at the time, it was really difficult to force them to do a more strong password. I said, well, okay, great. Well, if that's the problem, then why can't you just do it across the whole organization? And he's, why would we want to do that? So because that person in the call center can get hacked just as easily as the CEO. And if they get into our system, that's only a matter of time. If they manage to figure that out, it's only a matter of time before they figure out the keys to the kingdom, and we're in big trouble. So if you think it's that important, I'm okay with it to have shortening the length of time, changing the password, but not just for executives. It has to be for everybody. I'm not going through that. But this has been super interesting. I think you have a wealth of knowledge about cybersecurity. I'd love to have you back on another time, but we're out of time. So why don't you let people know where to find you if they want to connect?
And as I mentioned at some point earlier in our conversation, I live on LinkedIn, as I'm sure many of your listeners do. And you can certainly find me there. And I would welcome the opportunity to connect with anybody who listens and feels that they either have questions or just wants to have a friendly chat. And always open, excuse me, to connection requests from people on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, really appreciate your time today and all the wealth of information you provided. It's been great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Pleasure to be here and welcome the opportunity to answer questions as follow ups if you guys want to connect.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for watching Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge. New episodes every Wednesday, 8 a.m. Pacific time on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Hope you have a great week and hope you come back next week for another episode.